Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And this is our last class session for the semester, so that's a good thing. And all we're going to do just one really final bit of information that we didn't cover, and I had intended to back in chapter 9 or back in week 9, and it was a week that I was out sick, and so we were kind of moving some things around, and I decided, and that was leading up to the first exam, and I decided that we would not talk about it then, but I do want to talk about it now. And it's called the Phillips curve relationship, and so I'm going to talk a bit about that. And just to give you a heads up as to what we're doing today, I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about the exam, which exam is done. It's going to be posted as soon as I wrap up today. And I'm recording this class session so that particularly for you, part of this, if you want to go back and look at this, you'll have that. Hopefully we won't have any difficulties with the recording. Occasionally these recordings get kind of garbled and messed up. Hopefully that won't be an issue, but I would encourage you to stay with us. But it will be available, and I'll post that one week sometime after class today. It takes a little bit of time. It has to compress to an MP4 file and all that, but it doesn't take all that long, so hopefully that'll be available. So before I leave today, I'll post the PowerPoint slides, and only a couple for this week. I'll make the exam available because it's done, and I'll also post this video. So you should have everything you need in order to prepare for the exam. And the exam will be available from today through the end of the day on Sunday. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Okay. So before we get started, any questions for me about anything at all? Looks like you're all muted, so you can feel free to unmute yourself now if you like and ask any questions, or you can put something into the chat box. As I sort of move this way, I kind of get away from the chat box, but I do intend to see it. So, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about, we've covered a lot of ground so far in this class, and we've talked a bit about economic policy toward the very end. And a lot of the exam will be dealing with the issue of economic policy, but I do want to talk about how policy is informed. That is basically, what are some of the motivating factors that drive economic policy? And so I think this is a really important thing for us to talk about, because you got to wonder, why does the government do what it does when it does? I think that's an important question for us to answer. Okay, so in order to answer the question, then I put up here, and I know we talked a bit about unemployment up to this point, and we talked about a little bit about how it's defined and why it's bad and all that. And we haven't really talked that much about inflation. We have a little bit, sort of intermittently, but not really to the extent that I think we probably ought to. So let's give you a definition. This is one of those textbook definitions of inflation. It's defined as really two ways. It's defined as a general rise in the overall price level, and that is the physical flow. If you remember that model where we had the red arrows going one way, that is households providing labor, or firms providing goods. And then we had a financial flow. It was the green arrows, money going this way, firms paying for labor with wages, households paying for goods with money. In the physical flow, this was simply defined as the rise in the overall price level. And really the key item here is the general. And I know that right now we're in an inflationary environment. And I've talked about this throughout the semester, but we are definitely in an inflationary environment in which prices are rising. But the thing to know about inflation is that it's a general rise in the price level. And I know that occasionally when people see a spike in the price of something, and gasoline comes to mind often, where people will make the sort of broader generalization that it's inflation throughout the economy. And that may not be the case at all. Oil is an extremely volatile good. It's probably one of the most volatile in terms of percentage movements. I mean, it's been on the way down in the last few weeks, months, but it was on its way up for a time. And I don't think I need to remind anybody here, anybody who's bought gas knows that it's been up, it's been down. I think people sort of understand that. It's a very volatile, but it doesn't necessarily signal that inflation is imminent. Gasoline and oil and everything connected with fossil fuels has been on its way down in the last few weeks. And so as a result, it's a part of the inflation rate for sure, but it's not the only and it's not the dominant thing. So when we talk about inflation, we're talking about a general rise in prices across the board. Food and energy are the two broad categories that oftentimes just simply cut out of the inflation rate to arrive at what economists call core inflation. That is taking out those two most volatile pieces of the price index, which is used. An index is simply a collection of goods whose prices are tracked. Sometimes they'll just take those two categories out because they're so volatile. They're up, they're down for all kinds of reasons. We know that energy is very volatile, but also so is food. So what's left then are things like housing, furniture, fixed assets, or durable goods like cars and computers and furniture and those kinds of things, and services like healthcare and entertainment, those kind of things. That's pretty much everything else is left. And so when there's a general rise in the price level, we'll see it there. That's one definition. The other definition is really the flip side of the same coin, and that is a drop in the price, in the value of money. It's a drop in the value of money, because if it takes more dollars to buy the same good this month than it did 6 months ago, it must mean those dollars are worth less. And over time, we know that the value of money does go down over time because the inflation rate goes up and up and up. And what is very interesting is that the environment we're living now, we're on a pace to probably do 7 or 8% inflation macroeconomically throughout the economy this year. I suspect next year it's going to be less, mostly because of the fact that the government, through our Federal Reserve, it's really hitting the brakes on the economy, trying to slow things down, trying to slow borrowing down. And we're already starting to see that in real estate, which is sales of real estate have come to a screeching halt. And that's because of interest rates primarily, but anything real estate connected is very much tied to the interest rate. And so anything tied to interest rates is very sensitive to any kind of monetary policy movement, which either restricts or allows it to flourish. So that's the definition of inflation. Why are we talking about that? Because there's an important relationship that developed beginning around, but it was really by observational information based on some data gathered around the, oops, I went the wrong way. In the 1940s and 50s by an economist named William Phillips, who was a New Zealand economist who did most of his work in England at the time, and he arrived at some observational data that said basically the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And I should have mentioned in the syllabus that this is discussed in your textbook, in the McConnell text. The Phillips curve relationship is discussed, and I've got another PowerPoint slide that sort of summarizes what I'm going to talk about here. So you can, and I don't know, you have to look in the text, and if you can't find it, just let me know. All you have to do is just look at the index to the text and find out where it is. It may be in a couple different places, actually, because it's a fairly well-known relationship. So what was Phillips up to? What was he doing? He was studying basically inflation data and unemployment data for primarily the US and Britain in the 1940s and 1950s. And he arrived at some information that basically he would plot this data. And occasionally had some outline information look like that. But he arrived at a curve that, using statistical smoothing techniques, was mostly downward sloping. Maybe it was a little bit more curvy. This looks a little bit more like a straight line, but nonetheless, the relationship was inverse, meaning as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. And I'll give you some examples of what we mean here in just a second. The idea is whenever you have an inversely, in the first quadrant here, anything downward sloping represents some sort of inverse relationship between whatever variables are being plotted on the axes. In this case, you've got the inflation rate, which is expressed as a percentage, right? The rise in the price level. So this year we're saying we might have about a 7% inflation rate for 2022 versus the unemployment rate, which for this year, it's probably going to come out to be around, I would say 3.6, 3.7, something like that. We're at a 3.7% unemployment rate as of the end of November. And we get this data on a monthly basis. But there are a number of different unemployment rates. And if you take macro here or someplace, you might get into some discussion about the fact that there are different ways we include who's unemployed and who's not. There are people who are underemployed, that is people working part-time, for instance, who would like to be working full-time but are not. We don't necessarily count them as being unemployed, except we do have a way to account for those underemployed people. So anyway, this data was sort of collected and sort of put together as a curve here, downward sloping and inverse. And basically what it represents is a dilemma, okay? It's a policy dilemma. And remember, everywhere in econ, when we talk about the word policy, we're almost always talking about government policy as to what to do about something. And econ, if you don't like econ, which, join the club, a lot of people don't, but it's the world in which we live. And the reason we study it so intensely is so we can do things about it. We can do things about inflation. We can do things about unemployment. But this presented at 11 basically said this: if the inflation rate is high, let's say we've got an 8% inflation rate, which I think most people would associate with being high, and that we have a 4% unemployment rate, how do we deal with, what is the current problem that people would say is the issue? Well, I mean, we're living in a particular sort of experimental situation where it's actually not too experimental because we're here. But right now, the issue is to bring down the unemployment, just to bring down the inflation rate. So what if the inflation rate did come down to say 3%? This represents a dilemma because in order to do that, we buy ourselves increasing the unemployment rate. Meaning that if you slow the economy down in order to squeeze out excess borrowing, excess demand, because keep in mind, a lot of times these prices are rising because people are taking goods off shelves. Goods are flying off shelves for whatever reason. Low interest rates low interest rates, by the way, also encourage lots and lots of borrowing. We definitely saw that with real estate not too long ago, and also in the early part of this century. So one way to reduce demand for things that are interest sensitive are to raise interest rates. And that's one policy objective. And then we're not really, we talked a bit about that. We talked about monetary policy 2 or 3 weeks ago, but we're not really interested so much in how it's done. We know that one of the tools is that discount rate, which means the Federal Reserve can raise interest rates in order to squeeze out the inflation rate. But by slowing the economy down, you raise unemployment. And so this is a problem. It's like a whack-a-mole game, right? You hit the whack-a-mole, you hit the inflation mole, and that pops the unemployment rate. So as a result of this, what if we were to reverse this and say, okay, well, so now we have 6% unemployment, that's considered too high. What if we whack that mole, we speed the economy up? We cut interest rates, we cut taxes, we increase government spending. And as a result, we bring the unemployment rate down, we put people back to work, but as a result, inflation pops back up. So you've got this sort of inverse relationship, this movement up and down along the Phillips curve that says, you've got this dilemma, that is, what do you deal with? What do you prioritize? And I think that we had a discussion activity that we sort of laid this dilemma out, that is, which do you lean on? Do you try to deal with inflation much more and risk unemployment? That is, we'll take our chances that, that unemployment will take care of itself in the long run. We've really got to deal with inflation. Or are we really more concerned about the labor force and unemployment, and we'll risk a little bit of inflation? Well, I think the Federal Reserve, which is primarily the agency responsible for dealing with inflation, would focus on the inflation rate primarily. And it does seem that fiscal policymakers, elected officials, would tend to focus more on unemployment because these are voters, these are constituents, these are people who can actually pick up the phone and call them and protest and all these other kind of things if there's high unemployment, and they don't want that. I mean, what elected official would? But these are not elected officials who deal with the inflation rate that is through the Federal Reserve. And by the way, I think it was very interesting because I know President Biden's party opposite, the Republicans, ran against the Democrats this last election cycle, using inflation as one of those arguments that, hey, President Biden, is not doing a good job because of that. And I don't think voters really bought it. And I said at the time, I think in class, I mentioned it, I'm not sure voters really are that responsive to inflation that much. And I don't think they really buy the fact that Joe Biden is responsible for it. In fact, we're going to make a case that presidents really don't have much to do with the inflation rate. They barely have anything to do with the unemployment rate. So if you wonder, what do presidents deal with economically? It's, well, they're sort of along for the ride. They very much are. Yes, they're politicians. They'll take credit for things when things are going well, but when things are not going well, they're a little bit less visible in that regard. But I think it's important to know that in dealing with inflation and having to slow the economy down, that is going this other direction, and by doing it, raising the unemployment rate, elected officials find it difficult to do, which is why we have a central bank that is appointed and not elected, so they can make those tough decisions. And there's a very famous story in the late 70s when inflation was just raging and much higher than it is now, 11% throughout the economy. And the Federal Reserve had a particularly difficult series of a couple of meetings, and the members of the FOMC, the policymaking body, went out to dinner and having drinks and all this and laughing and sort of kicking back after a couple of really hard decisions where they were going to raise the interest rate to like 21%. and a member of Congress walked in, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve told everybody to keep it down because of what they're going to do tomorrow. That is raise interest rates. In other words, push the unemployment rate up, which is what happened. And so elected officials find it difficult to do, and not so much with appointed officials. And so what's the answer to this dilemma? Well, the answer has been to try to find somewhere in the middle here, some sweet spot, given the fact that there is this sort of dilemma that is present throughout the entire situation here. The idea is to try to find what amount is acceptable. The idea is not all that different than our acceptance of other kinds of social problems, which we're always going to have in some measure. It's what amount we're willing to put up with, whether it's pollution, whether it's crime. And I don't think anybody is under any illusion that we're going to do away with all pollution, air pollution, water pollution, whatever, and we're going to do away with all poverty, or that we're going to do away with all crime. And all these are topics we covered in this class, and sort of laid out the case that economics as a social science tries to deal with these. And just from the economic perspective, there is always going to be some of these problems that are going to be there. What do we accept? What's the acceptable level? And I think that's what we have to arrive at. So this was a pretty firm relationship throughout economics for a very long time, up until about the late 70s, early 80s. And then something interesting happened, because what the Phillips curve relationship is telling us is that, okay, there's a trade-off. And so as a result, policymakers, you can choose. Pick your medicine. Do you want high unemployment and low inflation, or low inflation and high unemployment? Or do you want something in the middle where you're going to have both of a little of both, but maybe not high amounts of both? Well, that was sort of the default setting. Here's the problem. Beginning in the late 70s and early 80s, something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. And that was the idea that, because what does this tell us? It tells us that it's the whack-a-mole game. You get more of one, you get one thing, knock it down, the other thing pops up. You hit that mole, and the other one pops up. There's a trade-off. At least you get the benefit of having one lower thing, even while the other thing is rising. But here we have the worst of both worlds. That was the entire curve began to shift to the right, meaning that we now began to have more of both of everything. More inflation, more unemployment, more inflation, more unemployment. This wasn't supposed to happen. And the phenomenon, it was a term that was coined during this time. Your text, I believe, talks about it. It's called stagflation. Stagflation, which was a sort of made-up term to describe a stagnant economy, high unemployment rate within an inflationary condition. So if this wasn't bad enough to begin with, this relationship, this inverse relationship, this was the worst of both worlds. And it was such a serious problem that, as I'm told, economics textbooks publishers were saying to the economics profession that they needed to sort this out. They needed to reconcile this particular theory, which was looking pretty good. Phillips was sort of on his way to a Nobel Prize, I think, until stagflation occurred. I think he actually died before that was sort of invalidated. But we're saying the Phillips curve was sort of invalidated with this longer term shift. Now, there have been subsequent studies that we're not going to talk about here that have sort of indicated, what was this due to? I mean, was it the inflation rate driving all this stuff up, or was the unemployment rate driving all this stuff up? Because we have made the case before that the two main problems in economics, which policymakers are trying to steer the car between, the one ditch that is inflation, the other ditch that's unemployment, they're trying to keep it somewhere in the middle. But those are the two problems, the two biggest problems. We're making the case that you can try to steer the car between these, but what's the issue? And this is why we plot these on these axes, which is why this was such an important model. The issue is that if we're trying to deal with these, this sort of invalidates the whole thing through the presence of stagflation. But subsequent studies have shown that this was the real culprit, which is why the Federal Reserve really tried to deal with this, and actually ended up throwing the economy to a very high unemployment situation, a very deep recession between 1980 and 1982. And the unemployment rate was double digits. Right now, we're below 4%. In fact, we're probably below full employment, which is a good thing, but not so good because we've got an inflation rate that's high. So the Phillips curve probably does work in the short term. In the longer term, it could be invalidated. What happened in the late 70s, early 80s was that inflation was so high that businesses didn't really know what to expect, didn't know how to price goods, didn't know for the long run, didn't know what to invest in terms of new products, new plant investment, because you didn't really know how to budget for very high inflation. and you didn't know what your wage costs were going to be, your materials costs were going to be. And so as a result, businesses sort of hunkered down. They didn't do very much. They didn't do a lot of hiring, didn't do a lot of expansion. And we need expansion in order to keep our unemployment rate down. And as John F. Kennedy said, right, in his last interview before he died, that we've got to keep growing the economy just to keep the inflation rate where it is, because we're adding new people all the time to the economy. We've got to keep people employed who are willing and able to be employed, and we got to do that through growth. And the only way to do it through growth is to have new investment in machinery, equipment, products, and all that. And I think businesses really pulled their horns in and just sort of said, let's wait this out. Let's get out of the recession, then we'll deal with it. And so that's why you had these twin problems. That's the culprit. That's the prevailing theory right now. And in fact, I think probably the Federal Reserve at the time probably went a little bit too extreme in trying to deal with the inflationary condition. Because the unemployment rate, I can remember having at that time lived in our country, that the unemployment rate in some parts of the country was as high as 25%, and that is very high. And we're not counting teens or anything like that. We're talking about it's the 18 to 54 cohort. So, okay, so what about the Phillips curve? And this is the very last slide, and we'll talk about the exam. So what is it all about? It's named for William Phillips, and it's based on his decades-long study of employment and inflation in both Britain and the US, asserted an inverse relationship between inflation and employment, and presented the trade-off. And then it was invalidated in the long run. LR stands for long run, by the existence of stagflation beginning in the late 70s and through the 80s. And some work by the Canadian economist Robert Mundell really was the person responsible for saying it's inflation that's a bigger problem than unemployment, which sounds like, if you're somebody who maybe favors dealing with a little bit of inflation but keeping unemployment low, that it sounds kind of cold-hearted and say, hey, let's deal with the price level, and the labor force can work its own problems out. It does sound like a difficult thing to understand and to accept for a lot of people. So I do get that. So that's the Phillips curve. That was the last bit of content that we didn't get to, and I wanted to cover it here. And I knew that I wanted to have a review session before the exam, so I didn't want to get into a lot of material. I just did want, however, to talk a bit about some of this wrap-up material here, and we pretty much covered everything that I thought was interesting to cover in this course. And so, any questions for me about anything regarding Phillips and inflation, unemployment trade-off, the long-run policy dilemma, etc.? Okay, well, let's talk about the exam, and I'll spend as much time as requires talking about it and letting you know what to expect for the exam. The exam is done, so it's going to be available. It'll be available from sometime after class, but not too long after, just a few minutes until Sunday. And so you've got until Sunday evening to take it. You'll have 90 minutes. It's going to be in Brightspace. Just go into the week 15 module and you can see it. Just click on it and start from there. Keep in mind the clock is running. So even though it's an internet exam, so you've got any resource available to you, the websites, the textbook, notes, copies of PowerPoints, whatever. Try to use your time wisely. The 40 questions, which gives you a little bit over a couple minutes each, but I know that a lot of instructors everywhere in colleges, some of them are very much against the idea of open, quote unquote, open book exams, because of the fact that they feel like people are using it as too much of a crutch and not being prepared. So I'm going to leave that to you to decide whether or not how much preparation you'll need to do before that. And if you want to wait till Saturday, Sunday to take the exam, feel free to do so. If you wait till Sunday, which is fine. I mean, I think we all have a tendency to push things toward the end. But you get kicked out for whatever reason, send me an email. I'll be checking it throughout the weekend. I'll have to reset it. One thing about Brightspace is it does not seem to go down and crash as much as some other systems that we worked in the past. So I very rarely get those kinds of messages. But if it happens, because Monday or Sunday is the last day of the semester, it's done. And really, we don't have a chance to do makeup opportunities because I'll be posting the grades, the final grades for the course on Monday. And you'll be able to see how well you did. So on the exam, so I don't have a fill in the blank part like I did on the first exam, mostly because I want your grades to be more immediate, and which they'll be once you complete the exam, hit submit, it'll be done. It'll score automatically, 100 points possible. Like before, there are 10 true false questions with 2.5 points each. 30 multiple choice instead of 20 multiple choice and 10 fill in the blank. So 30 multiple choice times 2.5, and then which is 75 points, and altogether that equals 100. So that is the layout of the exam itself. It'll be in Brightspace, and so try to give yourself enough time to do that if you would, so that you're able to to be prepared for it. Okay. All right. So let's do this. Let's talk a bit about the exam and what we can expect for the exam. So we talked a bit about this. So there are two exams in the class, and we sort of cut it off about halfway through. And we talked about monetary policy both prior to that exam. So there were a few questions about that on the first exam. We get a little bit more into detail into it here, mostly because I just wanted to sort of introduce people to it in the early stages of the class and then get a little bit more detailed into it this time. So know what fiscal policy is. There are two forms of government economic management of the economy in order to try to deal with these twin perils of inflation on the one hand, unemployment on the other. Those two policy categories are fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is controlled by elected officials, Congress, and the president, and it consists of taxation and government spending. Monetary policy is conducted by appointed officials at the Federal Reserve, and they deal with the supply of money and the availability of credit. The interest rate mechanism being one of those key tools, but also, and there's a question about this, open market. We talked a bit about the idea of the government going in and buying or selling government securities in order to put money into the economy or take money out. If they're buying securities, they're putting money into the economy to boost the economy. If they're selling, they're taking money out. They're selling securities to the public, taking their cash, in other words, withdrawing cash from the economy, which is where the government is right now, where the Federal Reserve is right now. So know that the tools that are policy are taxation and government spending. And in monetary policy, there are three tools. There's open market operations, which is the most important that we just talked about. Also, setting the reserve ratio. The reserve ratio is that percentage of deposits that banks have to set aside on deposit at the Federal Reserve. It's money basically, you can think of it as being taken out of the game. It can't be used, can't be loaned, it can't be invested, so it's taken out of play. That's the second tool. The third tool is the discount rate, which is simply a rate of interest that's charged by the Federal Reserve to banks that borrow from it. Okay, so those are the three tools. Know which they are. Okay, but know also this idea that I just said a second ago. Fiscal policy tends to be dominated by, is dominated by elected officials, Congress, and the president, those two actors. We're talking about the federal government here. I know the states have their own budgets and taxation, but it doesn't really qualify for stabilization. That is, when we talk about fiscal and monetary policy, we're talking about how the government is trying to stabilize the broad macroeconomy. States are not really trying to stabilize the entire macroeconomy. They're trying to deal with their own state budgets, taxation, and government spending. So we're talking about the federal government and fiscal policy being controlled by Congress and the president, all of whom are elected. Monetary policy are appointed by the president. And as members of the Federal Reserve Board are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. There are some members of the district banks who are elected within their districts, and there are 5 of those who sit and rotate on and off what's called the Federal Open Market Committee. Okay, and I don't believe there are any questions about the Federal Open Market Committee, other than the fact that it's really the most important sort of subcommittee of the Federal Reserve. Okay, you want to know, so there are also a couple of questions dealing with budget in general. We talked about what budget surpluses were and budget deficits are. Surpluses are the case in which the government takes in more taxes than what it's spending in a given year. So it's got an excess, it's got a surplus. A deficit is where the government spends more than what it takes in. So as a result, it's got a shortage, a deficit. Okay, so if taxes are greater than government spending, it's a surplus. Taxes are less than government spending, it's a deficit. Right now, for many years, we've been in a deficit. And the deficit itself is usually financed by borrowing, going to the rest of the world and borrowing. When I say the rest of the world, it's mostly Americans who own the debt. In fact, a lot of it's owned by our Federal Reserve, to be honest with you. I know that we hear all the stories about foreign holders of debt who are up to no good, sort of conspiracy theory. That's really not that big of a concern, frankly. Anybody can own federal debt, and you can just simply buy savings bonds or buy treasury bonds through treasury bills, notes, or bonds through a broker. Not difficult to do at all. It tends to be how we finance the deficit. If the taxes are mostly roughly equal to the government spending, we say we have a balanced budget, which we haven't had in a long time. And what constitutes a balanced budget? Does it round with T equals G to the penny, or is it somewhat close? I think it's somewhat close. And we talked about two different theories of balanced budgets. One was the annually balanced budget, which is a proposal, it's an idea. It had a bit of momentum behind it back in the 90s and maybe 80s and 90s, where the idea was we balance the budget every year. Members of Congress recommending that we even have a constitutional amendment, amending the Constitution to require it. Never got very far, mostly because of the fact that what it does is it's considered to be what we call pro-cyclical. It adds fuel to the fire. The economy is going great, and as a result, we can have an inflationary condition. But also, we dig ourselves deeper in a hole during a recession. So when we say pro-cyclical, we're saying it magnifies the business cycle up or down. That's what gives rise to booms and busts. And one of the things that we have talked about intermittently in this class is the idea that it's very healthy for an economy to smooth out those ups and downs, which are going to be inevitable. We're going to have the overall trend can be upward in terms of economic growth, but we don't need big booms, boom, bust, because that's disruptive in a lot of ways, many ways. Smoothing that out is an objective. Okay, so the cyclically balanced budget is what's called counter-cyclical. It works against the business cycle. Particularly helps on the downside when the economy is not doing well. We have high unemployment and recession. The government can inject cash into the economy. And so as a result, this means that what does the balanced budget part of it come in? The idea is, well, both those have the term balanced budget. The idea is that you might have a surplus in 1 year and a deficit next year, or whatever, next 2 years or whatever. But over time, the budget is balanced, but it's just not balanced every year. It's balanced over the longer run. That's the idea. It's more theoretical than it is anything else. But it's important to know that there are still lots of voices among elected officials for trying to balance the budget, the fiscal budget, every year. And it hasn't happened in a long time. And in fact, frankly, we don't hear as much about it as what we used to. Gotten used to budget deficits and the national debt that goes along with it. Okay. So now also these directions of these tools. When we talked about fiscal policy, we said during a period of higher unemployment and recession, the government could do what? Its fiscal tools, cut taxes and increase government spending. By the way, isn't that what the government did during the most recent downturn caused by COVID? Cut taxes, which it certainly did, and also massively increased government spending through stimulus checks, increased unemployment benefits, lengthened terms for unemployment benefits, enhanced stimulus to businesses as well as individuals. That's the tool that was used, and so that was playing out before our very eyes. If, on the other hand, the government wanted to sort of dial things down and bring the economy down from high inflation, which frankly it's not the right actor to do, but it could raise taxes and cut government spending. That has happened in the past, and it's usually not considered to be politically too advantageous for those who agree to do that. President Bush, the first President Bush, is thought to have lost his election by going back on a pledge, ran for president not to raise taxes. He ended up doing that, and he was rewarded with being defeated for re-election. I'm sure there were other factors. It's never that easy, but that was certainly one of those. Okay, and then also what the tools would be for monetary policy. If you are in a recession, you would lower interest rates and inject money into the economy. And if inflation is the problem, as it is right now, you would raise interest rates, which is what the Federal Reserve is doing, and you would try to pull money out of the economy, which is happening. And it's happening fairly slowly. We're still seeing a fairly robust stock market. It's off its highs and whatnot, but we're starting to see some of this happen. We're seeing energy prices fall, food prices begin to fall. Some of the housing mania that we've gotten ourselves into the last few years, housing prices starting to maybe level off a bit. I mean, there are parts of the country in which home ownership is really out of reach for a lot of people, just because of the fact that home prices are really just out of control. I mean, I think it's a serious problem, and the whole idea of housing. If you follow what's going on in Albuquerque, certainly housing and housing affordability is a big problem everywhere in the country, and it's certainly here, no question about it. Okay, so that would be the tools that would be used on the monetary policy side to deal with inflation, that is to raise interest rates and to reduce. When it comes to choking off credit, raising interest rates will do that because fewer people will be incentivized to borrow, and fewer people are going to qualify because they won't meet the qualifications at these higher interest rates than they would at lower interest rates. Okay, simple affordability. Okay, all right, so let me see here. What else do we want to talk about? Talking about the national debt. National debt is this figure that is about $27 trillion. It encapsulates all of the borrowing over time that was used to finance deficit spending over time. We are still paying for World War II. We're still paying for World War I. Space program in the 1960s. All these deficits are still being financed, and I know there have been dire predictions forever about what the sky is going to fall with all this debt, and it hasn't happened yet. And so that the debt is out there and it's growing. But what it is simply that accumulation of all our Treasury departments borrowing from whoever wants to lend the government money, lending it at the rate of interest, through Treasury bonds, savings bonds, and things like that. Okay. Let's see here. There's also, when it comes to fiscal policy, there are a number of lags that we talked about, and they're cumulative lags, meaning that one lag, which might last a certain period of time, leads to the next lag, which is more time, which leads to another lag, which is more time. Those are the recognition lag, which is the time it takes for fiscal policymakers, Congress, and the president to recognize, hey, something is going on that we need to deal with. That's the first issue. That could be a few months before people realize there's something going on. I mean, it could very well be that we're in a recession right now. I think the odds are pretty good that we might be entering a recession. Keep in mind that with unemployment rates very low, but employment is what we call a lagging indicator. It trails. When the economy is recovering, it takes a while for people to get back to work because businesses are reluctant to hire them, but they're also reluctant to lay them off as the economy begins to slow down. And I know businesses do agonize over this more than what a lot of people might think. It's not that easy to lay people off and get more people to come back. Some businesses try to get the same people back, and being laid off doesn't exactly make laid off workers feel much love for their former employers. So they want to be a little bit cautious. And so the labor market is a lagging indicator, even though the unemployment rate is below 4%. If we are falling into a recession, which I suspect is going to be very likely for 2023, employment will be among the last variables to know it. But we're starting to see things slow down a little bit. And it just takes a bit of time for these policy things to take effect. There's a lag. Right now, the biggest lag is not fiscal, but it's more monetary. But we do talk about these fiscal lags, recognition lag, administrative lag is the time it takes to figure out what to do, make some policy. And then implementation lag is the time it takes for something to actually take effect. Those lags, and we talked about this in class, those lags are shorter in monetary policy, mostly because of the fact that there are fewer decision makers, maybe 12 people at the most, whereas there are 536 in fiscal policy. And obviously you get that many personalities and whatnot, it becomes difficult to arrive at a decision, frankly. And sometimes fiscal policy never arrives at deciding upon anything at all. Particularly there's political gridlock in Washington as we're sort of entering an era in which we are probably going to see a lot of that. So it's up to monetary policymakers who are politically removed from that process. They don't stand for election. They're not household names generally. Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman for about 20 years, was probably the closest thing we had to a household name in monetary policy. But that's, if you don't know who that is, it's because he's been going on for quite a while now. But he was very prominent on TV for a long time. Today, I think a lot of people would have trouble even knowing who runs monetary policy. Okay, so know about those lags. Know also what fiat currency is. We talked a bit about money, and we said there was a money supply of M1 and M2. M1 being that what we call most liquid, that is, it can be converted to cash very quickly. Checking account deposits can be converted to cash very quickly. Money orders, travelers' checks, cash and coin are already currency. So that's part of M1. M1 fits into a broader category of M2, which incorporates all of M1, But the non-M1 portion of M2 is mostly less liquid, like savings accounts, certificates of deposits, and some other oddball things that we're not covering here that all go into that. So one fits into the other. M2 is a cumulative measure, and so you want to know about that. And we say fiat, what we're saying is it's not backed by metals, not backed by gold or silver. I know there is a belief that maybe it is, but it's not. It hasn't been for a better part of 50 years. Most currencies in the world today are not backed by any kind of precious metals. They once were. The precious metals served their purpose for many centuries. Today, monetary policy, managing that money supply is a much better tool than managing the supply of gold and silver, which can fluctuate up and down. Okay. Also, we talked about this idea of the uses of money. We said that there are really three uses of money. There's money, probably the original use that we first discovered even as kids, is that of a medium of exchange. That's money to be used to make transactions, to buy things, pay for things. The second is money as a store of value. That is, money can be saved in its current form. It doesn't have to be converted to anything else. So money can be spent or saved, and that's an important idea. It's an idea that makes a lot of sense to everyone. Here, we can spend our money or save it, some combination. So those are two uses. And the third one is something called a unit of account. It's the way that we measure things of economic value in the economy. And by the way, I know that economists will oftentimes get criticism by non-economists for trying to put a dollar figure on everything, like to the point where, it seems a little bit grotesque if we're talking about the value of a human life, for instance, which sounds extremely distasteful. When I was an undergraduate, there was an economist in my department who had a sort of a side job testifying for plaintiffs' lawyers in labor cases when people were killed at work, and he would have to compute what these people's earnings would be over their lifetime, given their age and their earnings level and earnings potential and all that. So yes, economists will tend to put things in a dollar figure as a unit of account. And we certainly saw that with Becker, talking about the value of crime versus the value of not committing crimes. It was a landmark bit of work. He did win the Nobel Prize for that, and among other things as well. But it's just an economic way of looking at the world. No one's saying that it's the only way of looking at it. It's just another way of looking at it. And when we talk about Becker, by the way, he talked about this idea that criminals, or those, he doesn't like the word criminals because it sort of, labels people, but there are people who commit crimes that he calls offenders, which is a little bit more benign way of talking about it. But he said they have a higher risk preference generally than do the average person. The average person, he says, does not offend. The average person is not. That's a good thing, I think, right? The average person is not an offender and doesn't because they're more risk averting, which is considered normal and more average. I say normal, it's average, I think is probably the word. Most of us don't like to take a lot of risks. So most of us probably would not want to shoplift something for fear of getting caught, maybe even much more than for guilt of doing it in the first place. Something to think about. He's saying there's a reason why people don't do more crimes because they're afraid of getting caught. But he's saying that people who do offend have a higher risk preference. And in some cases, they may not fear going to jail for an extended period of time, whereas to a lot of people, I can speak for myself, that would terrify me spending any time in jail. Most of us, I think it would. But there are people that obviously have a different view of that. So he doesn't try to make a psychological analysis, rather simply a behavioral analysis based upon the marginal cost versus marginal benefits, which they look at. So there's a question about Becker, a question or two about Becker, that is the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost of doing something criminal versus not doing something criminal. We did talk about the economics of crime for a bit. Okay, I bring up Becker here because we're talking about a unit of account, because he was putting dollar figures on what's the ability to benefit from crime. He says it's a diminishing function. The more crimes you commit, you get less and less benefit because your chance of getting caught go up. Your marginal costs go up because of the fact that the more crimes you commit, the more that could be levied against you. And he argued more for a monetary punishment than a time punishment for that particular reason. Okay, so know about those uses of money, medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account. We also talked a bit about, not in great detail, but if you ever take a macro course, you'll undoubtedly come across it again, which is something called the quantity theory of money. There's an equation called MV equals PQ. You can certainly find that in the textbook. It's called the equation of exchange. I don't know if we specifically out of that, but the formula MV equals PQ. And there's a question in the exam about what those variables are. I think there's only one question, maybe two, dealing with that. Milton Friedman popularized that back in the 1960s and 70s. And although he wasn't the originator, he sort of was the economist who was most associated with criticism of inflation. That sort of was the big economic story of those days. So the quantity theory of money, know what M is. M is the money supply, V is the velocity of money, the number of times money turns over, P is the price level or prices of goods, Q is the quantity of goods. Okay. And we went over some of that in class as well. And that's a fairly straightforward economic or even mathematical relationship. Okay. We also talked about the some poverty questions in this segment of the class. And we had a definition of poverty that I think was comes from the U.S. government. It's the Department of Agriculture, which actually runs the SNAP program and the TANF programs. Whereas poverty is defined as the income that's below the cost of an annual, the daily diet, what it costs a person times 3. Because obviously people have to have more than just food, money to buy food. They have to have housing and clothing and all that. So it's cost of a daily diet times 3, and you multiply that by members of the household. And it's actually not quite that easy too, because there's a difference between those over 65 and those under 65. Because of if you're over 65, you have access to Medicare, government provided health care, where you do not. Okay. There was also there's a question about income versus wealth. We talked about this idea of poverty and the concept of poverty. We talked about income, which is the annual inflow of resources measured in dollar terms, right? It's a unit of account, versus wealth, which is simply you could take a picture, right? So income is the motion picture over the entire year. Wealth is a snapshot taken at a point in time. It's the accumulation of what people have been able to accumulate: cash and stocks and bonds and real estate, businesses, savings accounts, retirement accounts, those things. Okay, so know about that. We went through a series of slides in the class, and I gave you the websites for those, the links, the sources for those. I talked about this ever increasing gap in both income and wealth, particularly wealth in the U.S. It's getting wider all the time, and that is probably going to be one of the big discussions in economics for the next, well, rest of the century, I think, until we figure out what to do about it, if anything. And it doesn't look like anybody's really prepared to do much about wealth distribution. So I guess it's not considered to be a serious enough problem, but we'll see what shakes out. We'll see how it goes. Okay. Also, know about transfer payments. We talked about this before. We talked about poverty and some of the ways that we try to alleviate poverty is by a series of what we call transfer payments. Now, transfer payments are not solely intended to alleviate poverty, because Social Security is one of them. All the transfer payment is, it's called a transfer because it's a one-way movement of money from the government to a household, and sometimes, sometimes businesses, but it's not just to deal with these issues of people who are needing relief, because Social Security, and I'm talking here about primarily Social Security retirement income, is something that most of us can look forward to getting, regardless of our income or status in life when we're eligible age-wise. So I bring up that because it's a form of transfer. But transfers in general, though, are just simply one-way movements. There's no quid pro quo. You don't have to do anything in order to qualify. You just have to qualify to get things like Medicaid, food assistance, and whatnot. You have to apply. I mean, there's some administrative hurdles you have to go through. I'm not saying, when I say you don't have to do anything, I'm saying there's no transaction. You don't have to go to work in order to, I know that the government tried to get welfare benefits to actually go to work, and that didn't really work out so well, because there's no reason why they weren't working in the first place. A lot of times because of the ridiculous cost of childcare. But they're one-way movements of money, but they're intended to alleviate poverty. And they include things like food assistance, housing assistance, income support, disability. And by the way, there is a substantial part of Social Security that is ability as well. Okay, so those are all transfer payments. You just want to know what those are. Okay. Also, you want to know what the difference between progressive and regressive taxation, particularly progressive. Progressive taxation says, right, or say it's based upon the idea that the more you earn, the more you pay in percentage of your income. It's an income tax. It's not taxes on goods, it's not real estate tax. It's tax on income. So the more you earn, the more you pay as a percentage of your tax or a percentage of your income. And so if it's a higher percentage, then that is what allows them to raise not just a higher dollar amount, but a higher percentage. And the lower your income, the lower your percentage, to the point where it could be negative. There are people who get a negative. And in some cases, New Mexico being one of them, you can get a negative tax if your income qualifies. And it's perfectly legal, which is one reason why people who expect to get it file their taxes as quickly as they can, because they know to get those negative taxes. Earned income credit is the big one for at federal level. And we have something in New Mexico. We have a couple of different, depending upon age and income. There's also one for in New Mexico for residents in Los Alamos County. It's a very expensive county, and so there's a relief for those residents. So I bring that up only because they're forms of transfers. The forms of transfers. Okay. Let's see. We also talked about externalities, and we said what are those? We define that as being those spillover effects, is another term. The unintended consequences of some economic activity that affects some third-party bystander, somebody unrelated to it. Somebody living downstream from a pollution, from a polluting power plant, for instance. They're living downstream, they have nothing to do with it. Maybe they're consumers, but that's irrelevant. Their role as consumers have nothing to do with the fact that they're getting sludge washed up on their own particular shoreline if they live on a river. That's an example. Air pollution certainly affects all of us. Those are negative externalities. Those are things that create what I call a marginal social cost. It's not just the private cost of producing them, there's the cost that is shifted onto society from things like pollution, criminal behavior, noise, those kind of things. But there are also some positive ones that create what we call a marginal social benefit. And that is people do things for their own reasons, as they do in all cases for the most part, but create spillovers for the rest of us. So getting vaccinated, you get vaccinated, you get your children vaccinated to help yourself and help everyone stay healthy within your family. But if you don't get sick, you don't make others sick. And so as a result, vaccinations create a positive externality, which is one reason why the government was so adamant about everyone getting vaccinated for COVID. And in fact, still are talking about that, because it does create a positive externality. Okay, that creates a marginal social benefit. And we talked about what are the ways to deal with these, and there are governmental solutions to deal with these, what we call corrections, and even the good things that create positives are thought to need a correction because society could use more of them. One solution is a Pigovian solution. Pigovian solutions named after the economist Cecil Pigou. And Pigovian taxes are the way to deal with negative externalities. That is, if someone's polluting, tax them for that. If someone's doing something offensive, fine them for it. Those are all, any kind of payments to government are considered to be taxes in this context. And so as a result, if there's a negative being created, tax that activity. And by the way, Becker talked about that as the externalities of criminal conduct. It raises everybody's insurance costs for one thing. So as a result, one way to compensate for this, to have the person who's offending monetary fine in order to at least partially compensate society for the externality he or she has created by that conduct. And so it's very much rooted in the idea of Pigovian solutions to those problems. But there also could be solutions or corrections to positives, and that is by government subsidies to subsidize this. So this is why you don't pay anything to get a COVID shot. Somebody's paying for it. It's not free, but it's the government paying for it. So, and that and flu shots and all those vaccinations. And it isn't; those aren't the only positive externalities or the only behaviors that create spillovers. We talked about higher education, which the government certainly supports through lots of subsidies. This is one reason why CNN is relatively less expensive. It's the same courses that you have in New Mexico State, but by and large, same sort of faculties, but different costs because of different funding structures. Higher education is thought to create a positive spillover So Pavlovian subsidization is the order. Now, when it comes to negatives, we also talked about a non-governmental solution, and one of those was called the Coase theorem, named for the economist named Ron Coase. We talked about the idea that it should be possible to work out the solutions to these negatives if private parties bargain with each other and arrive at a solution. In other words, don't involve government, don't involve the courts, which is a form of government, and that private parties ought to be able to work those out. So that's a non-governmental solution to externalities. Okay. Let's see here. And a question or two about the Phillips curve, which I did go over here in class today. What is the trade-off? It's between inflation and unemployment. Represents, at least in the short run, a policy choice. Which do you tolerate more of, inflation or unemployment? And that's really a dilemma. In the long run, the Phillips curve is thought to be a little less useful of a tool because it's possible for both of those to go up over time. And finally, the last one that we talked about was in the issue of the economics of crime. We talked about Steve Levitt, and Levitt came up with a very controversial theory back in the early 2000s that the drop in the violent crime rate was a result of legalized abortion. A lot of beginning in the 1970s, because those offenders simply didn't get born because they were not wanted in the first place. Those would-be offenders. It's an extremely controversial theory. Why do I talk about it? Because it is something that has been bouncing around in economics for a long time, and even non-economists, because Levitt has a blog and has written subsequent follow-ups in defense of his theory. Whatever you think about abortion is not so much. We're trying to get out of the ethics and morality of it, and really talk about whether or not it's an actual true finding. And so, so it's up to you. You can decide what you want to do with it. Economics is full of these controversial topics. We certainly have gotten our share of them here in this class. Okay, and I think that is pretty much all that is really covered in the exam. I talked a bit about Becker and this idea of marginal costs versus marginal benefits of crime. No, Gary Becker was the economist who came up with that idea. Also, there's a question about Friedman, and we had a discussion question, so that should be still sort of fresh in your memory, that Milton Friedman, who was considered to be a very unlikely voice for the legalization of drugs, including even the most dangerous drugs like heroin. He said it all should be legalized because the war on drugs was failing, the marginal costs exceeded the marginal benefits. And by the way, it wasn't doing much to deter usage anyway. If it did, it would have succeeded, but it wasn't. So as a result, he's saying to legalize it. So again, another pretty controversial subject from a guy who's a pretty conservative guy. So he surprised a lot of people with that theory, but held to it throughout the rest of his life, and he lived for quite a long time after that. So, okay, so I think that does it. I think I've covered everything that's going to be on the exam. Are there questions for me? I can open it up to anyone. You can unmute yourself or put something in the chat box if you like. Yes, it'll be auto-graded. And yeah, it's the first exam had the fill-in-the-blank questions. And so this was on me. I just forgot to go back and review those. It took a couple of weeks, and I apologize for that. I just didn't make a note in I have a very extensive to-do list, just didn't do that. I thought I'd avoid that and give you more immediate feedback. I think I'm probably going to avoid fill in the blanks going forward just for that particular reason. There's a lot of evidence that immediate feedback on exams and quizzes is a lot better. So yes, it's going to be immediate. You should know right away after that. Okay. So there's no manual grading of that at all. Okay. Any other questions for me about anything? Well, feel free to get with me anytime if you do have questions for me about the exam or anything else. Just send me an email. I'm getting a lot of email here in the last week of the course. I'm not quite as quick at getting back to people as I typically am, but I am getting back as quickly as I'm able to. I just every time I go back to my office, I've got another dozen emails, and so I just want everybody to sort of understand that I will get to you as quickly as possible. And certainly over the weekend, that probably will slow down. So if you do have something really critical, you want to let me know. Also, makeups are really not possible. It's not something. It's not my policy. It's the fact that I've got to report grades very quickly, and I push these exams all the way to the very last day of the semester just to give you more time do it. And I try to, give you a little bit more time than simply Friday through Sunday, which is what I usually do in any kind of an online course. A lot of courses are already wrapped up, right? But I do want to give you more time because I do have a reporting deadline. So, okay. And on the discussions, I've got a few of those to grade. I'll get to those, and then we'll be in the next few days back on that, so you can see what those. If you follow the guidelines of making a post, making a follow-up post, you should be fine. I'm not looking for lots and lots of data and detail on that, certainly, but if you've done that, you should be okay. And the grading on those will be as they have been before. So, okay. Any other questions for me? Okay. Well, I'm going to post a link to this. It'll be a little bit of time because it does what it does, and I'm going to upload it to YouTube, so it'll be you won't have to. You'll just click on the YouTube link. It won't be password protected or anything like that. I'll make the exam available here in just a second. And if you do have questions for me, feel free to get with me. Otherwise, it's been good having everybody in class. And I wish everybody luck in their future academic careers. Okay. All right. We'll see you.